Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Invest Africa. In today's discussion, we're tackling cross-border trade on the African continent. And to help me dissect this, I'm joined by Benson Mwesigwa. He's a senior manager and Africa executive at KPMG Africa. We also have Dianna Games. She is the chief executive of Africa at Work, and she's also the author of Business in Africa, a Corporate Insights. And from our Cape Town studio, we're joined by Oliver Facey, is the Vice President for Operations, and this is for DHL Express Sub-Saharan Africa. And we always go continental. Joining us from Lagos is Bisi Sanda, and he is a partner at EY. Everyone, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Dianna, I'm going to give you the floor first, not only because you're the lone woman in the pack, but also as the author who's also trying to capture the ease of doing business on the African continent. Set the landscape for us, paint the picture. What does Africa look like at this point, and what is the state of cross-border trade?
I think there's a commonly quoted figure of 12% of intra-African trade, of Africa's total trade. That figure varies according to regions. I think East Africa, you find the trade is much higher. People just throw out that one figure. I think it doesn't really represent the picture in all parts of the continent, and really brings down by the lowest common denominator. We've got, as you know, they're launching the negotiations for the tripartite free trade area this week. Yeah. The East African community is really moving ahead very fast in terms of deeper integration. I think it's one thing to have integration on paper, or possibly even discussions towards it. It doesn't mean goods are flowing freely across borders. It is still expensive to move goods around. We still have a lot of work to do on rail to make it easier and cheaper to move goods. And also there's a lot of other factors, like, for example, a lot of African production is not competitive. Yeah. People in Africa spend more time buying imported products than they do African products. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, which we can go into at another point. So you've given us a couple of points that I think we can latch onto. So Benson, let me start off by getting you to come in and maybe just to give us a sense of the 12% that Dianna is saying. It's not really an accurate reflection of what's happening on the continent, because we have pockets where there's deeper integration than in other parts. How would you describe the context and the state of cross-border trade on the continent?
Yeah, of course, we must realize that in Africa, it's very hard to have realistic data because of the complexities and the investment in that space. So that figure, to really ascertain it, it's very hard. But also, you can't deny the fact that there's growth. There's in intra-trade growth is really high, and it's a signpost, and it's a sign of growth for Africa, and there's a lot of interest. So I think, yes, on one side it's very hard to measure, but in context, we see a lot of interest from investors globally, even within Africa. And this is being fueled by the regional integration, like she mentioned, in East Africa, and then the ECOWAS in West Africa, and then here SADC. Of course, it's a process. These things you don't come here and then have a single region in a day. It takes a process, and there are frameworks that must be ratified. But we see progress, where some have been advanced, like in East Africa, and others, there's still some work to be done, but the whole picture is that we get there.
So it's a process, and it's one that you're saying is evolving. Before we get the industry perspective of a player in the field who's experiencing Africa on the ground, let's go to Lagos. We've spoken about East Africa. Benson has now put ECOWAS on the map. BC, give us a sense from a West African perspective. Are there positive movements along this process of progression that Benson speaks about that suggests that that cross-border trade, at least in that region, is improving?
I don't think one can say it's improving per se. Just as Dianna said, enumerating some of the issues militating against cross-border trade in Africa, the consumer is not buying a bundle of sentiments. It's essentially buying a bundle of products and services to meet, to get solution to certain needs of ease. And as Dianna said, the production in most of African countries aren't competitive at all. Maybe we come around to all the issues around it. So essentially, there isn't any advantage in one country trying to buy goods from across the other country. Even within the country, goods that travel over several kilometers to get to your nation often land in your nation far cheaper than the ones that are produced by the local manufacturers. So the African governments must come to terms with the issue of why is production not competitive in Africa.
Let me jump in because I think you raised a number of really important points and I don't want us to lose them. And one of them, and Dianna, I'm going to throw this to you because I saw you smile as it says this. It says, consumers are not buying a bundle of sentiments. Consumers want real products. I'll get to that, but let's go to Cape Town first. And I want to bring Oliver into this conversation. Oliver, you're a player on the ground. You've got real on the ground experience of cross-border trade or trying to move goods at least across borders on the African continent. Is the picture getting any better?
First of all, I think we should be grateful that trade is indeed growing. I heard 12% intra-Africa trade growing, so that's a positive to start with. What we also should be asking ourselves is what that intra-Africa trade really should look like and how we can get there. On the ground, absolutely. There is many barriers to moving trade around Africa easily. That is everything from infrastructure, road, rail, air. Just on the air, for example, which is where we specialize, a lot of over 12% of cities in Africa are only served by one flight a week, which in itself is a restriction in how we can connect with a large, diverse population. Another area is customs and regulations and other regulatory bodies. We, as a company, DHL, we really want to move trade fast, efficient, and meet the customer demands. However, not all customers understand that to move goods across borders, we have to accommodate the regulations, we have to stick to regulations, we have to be compliant. And with the regulation diversity across Africa, it makes it a very difficult scenario, which is why we really welcome the efforts being put in place at the moment to move ahead the tripartite free trade association, but also beyond that is moving towards the Abuja agreement in '91, where we're trying to get Africa, or Africa is trying to get Africa through the Africa Union to achieve that African economic community, which, seeing models around the world, somewhere like maybe NAFTA or European Union, these are models that work, not without their problems, but they work. And in our world, on the ground, if we can get good, solid agreements put in place through these trade associations and actually then stick to those, then we could really see some massive improvements.
Oliver, I want to pick up on something that you've just touched on. I want to throw it back to you at Dianna, because you raised the issue of the free trade area that's under negotiation. Oliver is putting again some of earlier agreements that need to come into fruition. Is policy keeping pace with the requirements of what's needed on the ground? Are agreements actually progressing to practical application?
My view is that policy is not keeping up with what's on the ground. What you're getting is a real tension between regional interests and national interests. So a lot of governments are looking at their own national interests and not looking at the bigger picture, the greater good of the bigger picture. And I think then you do have agreements that aren't implemented. So that's another layer of problems that in these free trade agreements. For example, the Yamoussoukro agreement for free skies, 50 odd years, I can't remember exactly. And the cost of flying around Africa is still very high as a result.
But why are we stuck, Benson, in this paradigm of even within regional communities that there's still national self-interest that comes first? Because clearly we're never going to move forward if we're not going to actually start looking at how do we position the region in the global value chain. What's it going to take for us to move forward?
Nozi, thank you. I think that's a big challenge for most of for trade in Africa. And yes, there's talk, but implementation is what is crucial to move, to have tangible results on the ground. So yes, we must also say that, from my view, if I speak from East Africa perspective, yes, you can see there are some benefits, for example, around resource mobility. If you are Ugandan and you want to set up a business in Rwanda or Kenya, you don't need a work permit or a visa. And those are serious issues that investors really need if we want to fuel growth on Africa. So I think this will require political commitment, because in Africa, still governments still call the shots. So the moment we have that commitment from the political heads, because they are the key decision makers, so that they can pass these policies and regulations which enhance integration through movement of goods and services, and have a deeper cooperation in infrastructure development. That's when you really see...
So you raise a very important point, because we're about to go to break. Before we do that, let's quickly go to Bisi back in Lagos, and let's talk about the infrastructure question that's being put on the table, where, again, I think everybody agrees that investment into infrastructure needs to be a priority if we are going to see a move from this 12% to a greater double-digit number. From your perspective, are you getting the sense that transport infrastructure is given the policy priority that it requires for us to move in that direction?
I don't think we are talking about infrastructure, we should limit it to just transportation, because studies have confirmed that the lack of power makes African industries, especially sub-Saharan African industries, to be up to about 30% less competitive with other parts of the world. And so the question of infrastructure has got to be taken up holistically. I'm aware that in the West African sub-region, there have been some initiative by some development finance institution to float a West African focused shipping line. Why is that? Because the land transport has become a problem which the government has been unable to solve. Fortunately, the waterways are there, so it's just a matter of getting your acts together to be able to, roll over the water.
We need to broaden this conversation if we're going to be looking at infrastructure investment. It can't just be about transport infrastructure. We need to look at infrastructure investment across the board. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we dig just a little bit deeper into cross-border trade in Africa and how we're going to be shifting from this 12%, which has become a common indicator of just how much trade we have taking place on the continent. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Invest Africa, and thank you so much for staying with us. And still with me are my guests here in Johannesburg. I've got Benson Mwesigwa. He's a senior manager and Africa executive at KPMG Africa. Dianna Games is also here in Johannesburg. She is the chief executive of Africa at Work and the author of Business in Africa, Corporate Insights. Joining us from the tip of the African continent in Cape Town is Oliver Facey. He's the vice president of operations for DHL Express Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, in Lagos, we are joined by Bisi Sanda. He is a partner at EY. Now, one of the points that Bisi raised before we went to break was whether development finance institutions are coming to the party. So let me throw a question to Cape Town on the basis of that comment and bring Oliver into the conversation. Say, Oliver, let's talk about the funding of initiatives like infrastructure that will enable better and accelerated cross-border trade in Africa. Do you get a sense that from a funding perspective, both governments and institutional investors and the private sector are coming to the party and really putting their dollars behind getting cross-border trade to be more efficient on the continent?
I think if you travel around Africa, you see a huge amount of development going on, whether it be roads, whether it be airports, whether it be ports. Less so on the railway. I understand there are some significant projects underway, but there's a lot of development going on. I guess the question is are they all connected with each other? And what we're doing from, if we represent private sector, is there is a lot of development going on in terms of the capability to handle goods from origin, destination, and getting them to points of key infrastructure like airports. So, as a company, we're investing, millions a year on whether it be vehicles, whether it be buildings, whether it be people, education. There's a lot of investment going on, I think, and that's very evident from a lot of the companies you see around Africa. From the government side, I'm not the expert on government infrastructure spending, but you see a lot of positive sentiment, you see a lot of positive result out in the field. And I think, if I was challenged to ask as to if there was something missing, is how does all that connect together? What's the big plan? And we're great at starting things, but are we great at finishing things? And that's really what we've got to see more of, is faster and finished infrastructure projects.
Dianna, can I get you to take a bite at that big question that he's just put on the table? Are we finishing off the projects that we're starting, and is there a master plan that connects every little initiative that everybody's trying to do in their little corner?
I wouldn't say there's a master plan. I think there are definitely regional plans. I know the African Development Bank is very involved in that, in the soft and hard infrastructure. A lot of, another aspect of this is that some of the hard infrastructure is in place. And if you look at the East African community, what they've done is the heads of state have agreed to remove all the impediments to trade that don't cost any money but are simply an issue of policy. And they did away with way bridges, roadblocks. They changed the way goods was being cleared for the region and so on. And according to the EAC, they have cut the time of travel from Mombasa port to Rwanda from 22 days to 5, and reduce the cost of exporting goods by half. Now that is a significant, it shows you how much policy is really standing in the way. And I think to make this infrastructure, which is very expensive, that is being built in Africa, to make it more efficient, you really need to invest in a lot of the soft and policy infrastructure. And it gets back to that national versus regional interests issue.
Absolutely. So I want us to pick up on this, Benson, and maybe get your comment on the underlying debate that's also coming through. And this is investment in rail versus investment in road, and whether there is policy coordination around that actually sees an interconnected system coming together, or are we seeing tension between these two forms of infrastructure vying for the same pot of funds?
Yeah, right. Again, I will speak from East Africa perspective, because that's where I have my roots. If you have the regional integration and deeper cooperation, like in Uganda and Kenya, Rwanda, they're building what they call the Northern Corridor. It's a rail from the Lamu port through Uganda to Rwanda and South Sudan. And of course, we can't deny that infrastructure is still a key issue in Africa, and you can't have the rail line everywhere. So the road is still necessary, because initially we used to have pit to port, but if you're an investor and you want to distribute your goods across a block, you need the roads within. The road network should be not only from the pit to the port, where it's maybe a single route, you need also roads within. So the two are still key for Africa, and even in other parts of the continent. So
let's go to Lagos. I mean, I think we've confined our conversation to looking at investing in infrastructure, but another part of this equation, Bisi, of course, is investing in the maintenance of infrastructure. Dianna made the point that the hard infrastructure is there. And she put the proposition to also focus on soft infrastructure. I'm proposing to you now that perhaps we also need to look at a reallocation of funds to address the issue of the maintenance of our infrastructure, because I don't think that that's actually getting its fair size of investment as it should be. Do I stand corrected?
Let me first comment on two questions you asked earlier on. There is a master plan, interestingly, which is outside of Africa. That is ridiculous, but that's the fact. America has Power for Africa plan, and it's got a budget behind it, got resources behind it, which unfortunately the African governments are still tinkering with by way of report and discussion at their various meetings, but not a solid action plan. Now, talking about the approach. Earlier on, I mentioned that the ECOWAS, right from inception, had the master plan for connecting all the member states by road network. And the agreement they had at that time was that each nation was going to build its own road network within its own borders. And it will be very easy to interconnect. Once you build up to the border with the next country, it's just a matter of building the connecting portion. Unfortunately, even within each of the African nations, they've not been able to build their infrastructure properly. And it is the same sad story across all of them. So it's neither an issue of whether there are sufficient funds to build infrastructure within or to build it across. Whichever approach you adopt, of course, you must be able to build your infrastructure within your nation. It's not as if the economic union is going to take on the responsibility to build your infrastructure for you. So if you're a responsible member of the union, you face your infrastructure, you develop it to a particular level, and then it interconnects with, in fact, if you look at the approach that the European Union is using to admit new members, they've got a number of issues which they're going to tick for any new applicant, and it's got to achieve a certain level, of efficiency before they can consider such members. So I think the African unions, they've got to approach the issue of the economic bloc more seriously and more responsibly. Otherwise, the benefits will never accrue.
So we're certainly hearing as a recurrent theme is a refocusing on how the economic models that we have at a regional level on the continent actually work, and maybe whether there's scope to borrow from international models that have worked in other markets. So as we begin to wrap up this conversation, I want to go back to the industry player on the ground, and I'll go back to Oliver in Cape Town. And Oliver, if I was to say to you, in order for you to surpass every single target that you've set for your business over the next 5 to 10 years, what needs to happen in your point of view within this context of trying to improve cross-border trade?
Okay, so I mean, we've had quite a focus here on sort of industrial infrastructure. I think we shouldn't lose sight of some of the more fundamentals investments that we should be looking at as well as people. Africa has got over 1 billion people in it, and in terms of education, in terms of awareness, especially around trade, especially around logistics, that we should be looking at more investment into our people so they understand what makes the world tick and how that's going to happen, and so we can feed that into people's understanding of what they've got to do. Also regulation. I mean, we've talked about the tripartite free trade zone. We're now talking about the continental free trade zone. These are regulations, and we have enough on the ground today that we should be tackling, and that can already take us a lot further than where we are today. If we could just get more commonality between how those regulations applied, and both between the free trade areas and also with the understandings on the ground locally with the regulation authorities, and get them applied holistically and in the same way, we're already going to move that 12% up to a much higher percentage. So I think it's easy to get sort of wrangled up into it's all down to needing more investment in roads and things, absolutely critical. But we should also look and see what we have on the ground that we can already take part in. So from our perspective, we have a big focus on people, DHL investment around Africa. We've put 14 aircraft into Africa, and I'm sure other companies are doing the same. It's really invest into what you can right now, keep moving to the edge of the envelope, and as the other infrastructure comes into play, then take advantage of it, and we can expand further.
So it's a keep moving forward story. Let's get a quick one from you, Benson. A key lever that you think needs to be unlocked to improve the cross-border trade in the country, on the continent rather.
Okay, thank you. Just like I mentioned earlier on, I think we need a stronger commitment from the political heads, but of course we must realize that they can't do it alone. The private sector needs to come in, and we have like a PPE. A PPP structure. But also in terms, I still believe that as the African continent, we need to be able to move our resources because you find some areas where maybe in the country X, you don't really have the required skills you need as an investor, and you can't move the people easily, and it becomes an issue.
So it's more than just about a good story, it's a very much a people story as well. Dianna, what's the next chapter of the African story going to look like if that chapter were going to be focused on cross-border trade? What do you think the key messaging would be there?
I think collaboration between countries, I think commitment at heads of state level, and I think the EAC, as I mentioned earlier, is a classic example of what can be achieved just by political will to iron out a lot of the things that are problems and to ask the private sector what do they need. That doesn't happen nearly enough. Business is not consulted, and yet government officials are making rules and regulations on behalf of business, if you like, but not consulting business. And it's a simple process to say, what is it that you need most, as we've just heard from DHL, and really thinking about implementing that as a type of a partnership.
So it's public-private partnerships. It seems to be the logical conclusion that everybody has rallied around. Government needs to not make regulations in a vacuum. They need to speak more to business to really get to understand what does business need. A very big thank you to my guests for joining me this evening. Benson Mwesigwa, Senior Manager and Africa Executive at KPMG Africa. Dianna Games, the Chief Executive of Africa at Work and the author of Business in Africa, Corporate Insights. From our Cape Town studio, Oliver Facey, Vice President of Operations for DHL Express in Sub-Saharan Africa, giving us his views of what business needs to move this conversation forward. And finally, Lagos was represented by Bisi Sanda. He is a partner at EY. For you at home, if you want to keep being a part of these conversations and to take these conversations forward, you can certainly do that. That's by following me at The Real Nosy, using the hashtag, of course, for the show, that is Invest Africa. Until next week.